name is Michael Hanna, and I am a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this afternoon's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civil and political life of their communities. The Institute is a nonpartisan organization and has been dedicated to promoting a healthy democracy for over 20 years. I want to take a quick moment to remind you that there is an emergency exit in the back of this room. You can also exit out through this door right here. I have the honor of introducing Mr. Joe McQuade. Mr. McQuade is a third-generation newspaperman over a 50-year career. He is currently serving as editor-at-large for the New Hampshire Union Leader. Mr. McQuade previously served as editor of the Union Leader and was a Sunday news reporter. He has several writing and journalism awards, including the Yankee Quill Award for the Academy of New England Journalists, and was inducted into the New England Newspaper Hall of Fame. Today, Mr. McQuade joins the Institute to present a true New Hampshire story about his parents in World War II, with War Fronts, Home Fires, a World War II correspondent's remarkable coverage, his wife's indomitable spirit. The book may be purchased online or in bookstores. I now welcome Mr. Joe McQuade to discuss this most
Welcome. We're not going to talk about the book. This is an old newspaper editor from so if you don't mind, he and I are going to swap war stories about newspapers. You remember when newspapers existed?
Yeah.
Little print things you could turn?
They still do.
They were thick. They're still existing? I'm not sure. I don't know what my dad would make of them. I called this book War Fronts, Home Fires. My son suggested the first part of the title because my dad was a war correspondent for the Chicago Daily News, and he was all over the world doing this. And I called it Home Fires because of the old expression, keep the home fires burning, which my mother, like thousands of American women, were doing at the time. Only I have a friend who runs a restaurant in Manchester, and he saw the title of my book, and he went, "Ooh, home fries! I love that." I got to get that book. I don't know whether he was just hungry that day or he's just dyslexic, but that's not what the title is about. They say that you should write about what you know, and I thought I knew a lot about my dad as a war correspondent. Nope. Didn't know the half of it. I'm astonished that this little kid from Candia, New Hampshire, whose formal education began in a one-room schoolhouse, and he spent a couple of years here. Not at college, though.
Prep school grad.
Prep school grad from the 1920s. And he had a bit of cosmopolitan education too. He was a office boy for a couple of summers for his father, who was a political editor and writer for William Randolph Hearst's Boston American newspaper. Now that meant Democratic. And I've never had the time to look it up, but the family lore is that when Calvin Coolidge decided not to seek a second full term of his own, my grandfather's lead was, "This spring, the sap from Vermont will not run." I don't want to look it up because it's too good to spoil. It's got to be there. I think my folks may have met at the Union and Leader. He was a reporter and aviation writer. Actually got his pilot's license in about 1935. And my mother worked briefly for her aunt, who ran the accounting department, and then during the war pretty much ran the paper because everybody else was away, including the guy who owned the paper, whose name was Colonel Frank Knox. Now the political students are supposed to know who that is. No way you would know who that is now. Frank Knox actually fought in Cuba with his buddy Teddy Roosevelt, and he tried to push him in the Bull Moose candidacy in 1912. Didn't work out, but Knox bought the Leader and then the Union, and that's how it became the Union Leader. But he also owned the Chicago Daily News, which had at the time one of the most renowned foreign staffs, foreign bureaus of any paper in the country. So my father and mother moved to Chicago, where my dad took up his work as covered aviation, wrote editorials, etc. And he knew the war was coming, as did my mother. And my dad wanted to get in it as a foreign bureau man. And Knox said, keep your shirt on, you got little kids. If war comes, you get your chance. If. Well, war came, and FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, knew there was going to be a war that America was going to have to win. And he asked Frank Knox, who had run as a Republican presidential candidate in 1936, to be his Secretary of the Navy, along with a guy named Henry Stimson as Secretary of War. What a title. Don't anyone tell Trump that there's a title of Secretary of War. It'll be right there. He wanted to have a bipartisan war cabinet, FDR did. So he had Knox and Stimson. And war came, and my dad brought the family back to Candia, and left my mom there. And I learned a new appreciation for her and people like her, because they had to step up, head of household, taking care of kids, dealing with rationing. Rationing included, she had to measure the square footage of each room in her house that she intended to heat so that she could apply for the oil heat rations. Same for gasoline. Coffee and sugar were in short supply. One year, ladies could have 3 pair of shoes. That's it. My mother wrote to my dad and said, I only need 1. There's a story in the book, which is not about them, but it's about Hill's Department Store in downtown Manchester. And they foolishly put a notice in the paper that they were going to have a sale on nylons in the middle of the war. 900 women showed up. And the story says that they actually broke a couple of the display cases, crushing in on. No one was injured, and a few people got their nylons. Meanwhile, my dad is off at the war, and my mom doesn't know where he is. And as a matter of fact, during the war, she often didn't know until she saw his byline in the newspaper. Oh, that's interesting. His first theater of war was in Alaska, in the Aleutian Islands, which not a lot of people knew of then and still don't know of today. And the Aleutian Islands have a little geological problem. They're socked in about 300 days of the year. So when the Japanese invaded and actually took over a couple of the islands, the American War Department was upset with our bombers because they couldn't tell them if the bombs that they were dropping actually hit or not. They were up too high. So the guy who was in charge of the Army Air Force up there, Colonel Wild Bill, you gotta have a Wild Bill, right? Erickson, devised low altitude bombing, where he would take a B-17 and fly it right along the oceans. And my father said you could see the water being picked up by the propellers. And they were more successful that way. But there's a story, my dad used to tell me usually only funny stories about the war. He didn't tell me this one, but I saw it in other places, including an autobiography by a gentleman named John Huston, movie producer, Treasure of Sierra Madre, Maltese Falcon. He was up there for the War Department filming. And in his, he doesn't have my dad's name in it, but I know it's my dad. He says Erickson's doing a low-level bomb, a lot of Japanese anti-aircraft flak coming up at him, and one shell comes right through the fuselage into the leg, the sleeve of the pilot. Doesn't penetrate. Pilot picks it up, puts it in his pocket. Now they're flying back to Alaska. My father says, gee, that's neat, can I have that? And the pilot says, no, I think I'm gonna keep this one, it's pretty nice. So they're flying back. My father says, I'll give you $5 for it. No, I tell you, I'm keeping it. Now, according to Houston's story, my dad got up to $20. That's a lot of money. Pilot doesn't say a word, but he pulls back on the stick, and the plane is now turning around, flying back into the aircraft. And the co-pilot and my dad go, what are you doing? Where are you going? The pilot says, for that much money, I'll get you one of your own. My dad talked to me late at night, Lucky Strikes and Johnny Walker, Black Labor, and very rarely about the tough parts of the war, which he covered and are in the book. He could get depressed with the rest of them. He was in the South Pacific, he was at Guadalcanal. He came in after the action of the island called Tarawa, which was the bloodiest battle that the U.S. Marine Corps had. And my dad's in another book by a friend of his, it's called Tarawa. And in it, my dad sees a dead Japanese officer with his knapsack open. And my father looks down and he pulls out a book, bound green baize book, Japanese markings down the side, opens it up. It's a compilation of 1936 National Geographic magazine. And the lead article is by a New Hampshire U.S. Senator, and it's all about New Hampshire. So my dad quoted in the other book says, gentlemen, I'm usually not a collector of souvenirs, probably because he couldn't get that shell. But he said, this is my souvenir. I was rereading the Tarot book one night at home, and the hair curled up on the back of my neck, and I turned around at our little library, and what do you think was in there?
Oh.
Tarot, 1936 National Geographic, Japanese marking. You can pass it around.
Wow.
See it. My father showed it to me one time, and he said, "Now, why do you think that Japanese guy was lugging that heavy book around?" I said, "Gee, Dad, I don't know. What do you think?" And he said, "Because after they took Tarawa, they were coming to Portsmouth, and he wanted to read up on it." Now, that's one heavy book that I'm sure he put in his knapsack and didn't take out a lot. This, however, he took with him. This is his portable typewriter.
Wow.
Can you imagine schlepping that, sir, from
Yeah.
Wow.
from Guadalcanal to Europe to Utah Beach? Yeah.
Wow.
I should have asked him a lot more questions. The editor wants to ask me questions, so I'll wrap up the formal part of this. My dad covered Patton's Third Army, and in researching the book, I read a college professor's book about Patton and the media, and there was a press conference that Patton had in which he intended to fire his public relations officer. Can you imagine, even in 1944, the officers who dealt with the press were called public relations officers. My father and the other war correspondents liked this guy. So my father got up a petition which everybody signed, and he presented to Patton, and Patton backed off, and the guy kept his job. But for some reason, my dad was persona non grata in Third Army after that, and he went over to the British Army for a while. His stories were all colorful. They're in France in the summer. He came in on Utah Beach on D-Day +1 next to a ship which was blown up, and he wrote about that. But he can't get to sleep. He and the other correspondents are in their tent, and he hears two guards outside talking, and one goes, "Hey, you smell that?" The first guy goes, "Yeah, what is it?" Some guy says, "Gas, it's gotta be gas." put on your gas mask, which they do. And then the first guy says, hey, should we tell the war correspondents? And the second guy says, and I'm cleaning this up, oh fudge, let him alone. But my father is curious, so he gets out of the tent, sniffs the air, no problem, knows what it is because he's a kid from Candy, New Hampshire. It's new mown hay. These two GIs are from Chicago or somewhere, and they don't know anything. There was a little book for war correspondents. There were several versions of it, told you what you could and couldn't do. All the war correspondents had the rank of like a second lieutenant. They could not carry firearms, but they had to obey orders. And they were censored on every story that they wrote. And if you want to look on this one, there are words actually cut out by the guy with his razor blade, the censor. And they censored my dad's letters to my mom, and she complained in one, what is this guy, a Baptist? He won't let you say anything. That's the high points.
Actually, Joe, I think you have quite a few high points beyond that, so let's talk a little bit about it.
Yep.
And then we'll have an opportunity, if folks have questions, we would welcome them, but let me start us off for a moment. So one of the things you mentioned in the foreword, Joe, is that your father co-authored this book. Can you explain what you meant by co-authored?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, my son said I should have given my father a byline on the book, because most of the book are my dad's stories as they appeared in these 70 newspapers around the country, and some of his letters to my mom and my mom's to him, because they were all in a little war trunk, which the only time I opened it before I began this research was to sneak cigarettes, which were World War II cigarettes, and they were very harsh. So, yeah, he's the reporter in the story because they're his stories, and that I didn't know what a good writer he was.
Well, he not only was a good writer, but you are a good researcher, and you unearthed all this work and learned, as you said in your opening, so much about him and also about your mother, which we're going to get into in a moment. But first, I'm a little fascinated because when folks think of servicemen or women that go overseas, they're usually in one theater for a good long period of time, and then maybe they go somewhere else, but typically and in World War II, they were in the European theater, in the Pacific, or what have you. Your father, as a war correspondent, though, was in the Aleutians. He was in the South Pacific. He was in, I'm sure I'm not going to get them all, he was in England. He was in France on D-Day +1, Utah Beach, although he couldn't say Utah Beach at the time in his report. And then he followed the march, I think with the Third Army, through France and through Belgium.
Well, by then he did his falling out with the Third Army, and as luck would have it, he tied in with the British Army. After the liberation of Paris, he writes a lovely story about that too, and mentions, oh, by the way, in the story, he got shot at there too. I neglected to mention that I started to count up the number of times that this guy almost bought the farm, and there were many, which he didn't talk about either. But he was with Montgomery in an operation called Market Basket. Bridge Too Far was the name of the movie in the book about it. It didn't work out too well, but my dad survived.
And some folks might be familiar with the Band of Brothers account of Market Garden, because that chronicled how there was a lot of humorous at the time as they were marching forward, and then of course that was quite a setback at the time. But what's interesting about it is, and I found it fascinating in the book, that it really paints a very broad picture of the World War II in not just one place, but in multiple places. And of course, that was his job, as was other correspondents, to tell all these stories. And one thing, and what I want to ask you about is, largely eyewitness accounts. So a lot of times he would put a personal spin on these accounts and really take the reader into wherever he was. And that was very powerful. So talk a little bit about that, because as a journalist, that's not all, today, it's not always the case that you're part of the story, but I think it was very effective in how he did it.
Well, I think that was his job. There were big picture correspondence. He covered some of that, but he was like the Ernie Pyle. He was there to get G.I. Joe's name, where he was from, so that the people back home, like my mother not knowing where he was, thousands of families had no idea where their son, brother, husband was, and to have a name pop up in a newspaper, that's my kid. He used to get letters after the war from the kids who were all grown up. Now, they'd been, teenagers or 20 years old during the war, and thanking him for writing about them. He did that, and that's one of the times that I know he almost bought the farm. He's trying to get the names of a tank that is leveling fire against the Germans, and the guy who's escorting him said, "I don't think I'd crawl up that ditch right now." And my dad goes, "Why?" "Because the minesweeper hasn't been by, and if you notice, there were still mines in the ditch." So names make news, as you know, and he got a hell of a lot of names of people in various branches of the service, and found out interesting things about these people besides what they were doing in the war.
And he was really at the tip of the spear in a lot of these engagements. I mean, I think about the Aleutians, for example. I mean, he was one of the first correspondents to be reporting about live action, because that was one of the first places. And as you said, I mean, not many people think of the Japanese being in American territory of Alaska, and yet he was reporting from it and had, I can't remember, but one of his first dispatches that finally was published was this very lengthy piece, I think, published in the Boston Globe, if I'm not mistaken.
With a headline which they would cringe over today, in its reference to Japanese people, and it was huge. He was like a local star, because he worked for his dad in Boston, and he worked on the Manchester paper. So a lot of the headlines in those two papers would have McQuade sees this and McQuade sees that. I also found an interesting statistic that frontline war correspondents, of which there weren't that many, maybe 1,600 in total, but not that many that were on the front lines, their casualty rate was comparable to American servicemen's rate during the war.
The biggest difference for them is they weren't carrying a firearm.
They weren't carrying a firearm, and man,
They were lugging a very heavy typewriter.
I have a wonderful picture in my office that my kids got me for Father's Day, because I wasn't going to spend the money on it. But it is of a dining room of a gentleman named Joseph Goebbels. I didn't have this in the book. Joseph Goebbels was Hitler's PR guy. And the GIs have now liberated this dining room, and there's a big portrait of Hitler on the mantle, and the GIs have put a sign over it that says "Kaput." And there were war correspondents sitting around the table having, I think, their first hot meal in a while. And it includes my dad and a guy named Howard K. Smith, later with ABC. Yeah. They did a good job, those war guys.
They did indeed. Your father wrote that the most important stories were about people rather than the war's big picture. There's something that resonates, right, with small and intimate details within the context of the big picture. And I think that his stories really not only told the story of the war, but as you indicated, specific individuals and their stories that at home people could feel it in a tangible way.
And people got upset about some of them. Even in the 1940s, we weren't all kiss and make up between the political parties. And one lady wrote to my father, I don't know when the letter caught up with him, but she was outraged at his coverage of something, and it turned out it was because he praised FDR in the piece. And she was clearly a good Republican and didn't want that man in the White House.
That's funny. Well, and, you know, it occurs, all the stories individually are wonderful, but when I'm reading the book, and if you haven't, please do, just a little pitch, I'll try to do 3 more. For $20.
That's what we agreed on?
That's, well, hey, it's cheaper than a bullet. But it occurs to me that when you piece all those stories together, it creates a tapestry of this event, this global event that you can go, that if you zero in, you can see it real close, you and me. But if you pull it back, you can see the entirety.
That's nice of you to say that. That's what I intended to do. We have generations who we're losing, and a lot of people have no clue about what that was all about, or how big it was, and how trying it was for Americans. Although I talked to a friend of mine today who's involved with the Wright Museum in Wolfboro. That's a World War II museum. And he was struck by a graphic up there about the percentage of Americans who were killed involved in the war versus Polish, German, others who just pretty much wiped out a lot of civilization. But I want people to understand the fighting guys' logic. We can't ever do it. My grandson, the oldest, is about to be 17, and he loved the Band of Brothers. But I said, you got to remember that it's very well done, and it's based on true accounts, but it's still a story as opposed to the real thing. And there's no glory. It was all just saving your buddy and yourself to live the next day. My dad would dig up people with backstories. He found one guy who was working on a ship. I think it was the ship that my dad lugged his typewriter back to because the typewriter was broken. What do you do then? You know, there's no Amazon that you can get another one the next day. And this guy he'd been a fighter in the Spanish Civil War.
Wow.
And it re-upped for this.
There are seminal events in every generation, and sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, they fade. And I think of 9/11, for example. Obviously, massive global implications tore at our country. And doing these kinds of talks, I would use our newsroom at the time and an example from 9/11 and what happened there, as many newsrooms do. And in the beginning, there'd be barely a dry eye in the house when you started talking about it. 4 or 5 years later, someone finally said to me, you got a hook with that story. It's not resonating with the younger people as much. They know it, but they see it as history. So my question is, World War II and stories of World War II seem to stand the test of time, even when so many very important things seem to fade a little bit more. Why do you think that is?
Because it was global, and it lasted as long as it did. I hate to say it, but with today's appetite for things, and they're gone in a minute. 911 was gone. Okay, you know, what else is going to happen? Short attention spans. But World War II affected, in some way, pretty much every family in the United States and in the other countries that were involved in it. There was a guy that I knew in Manchester. His name was Marty Laughlin. He was a U.S. District Court judge. And he gave me once, and I'm not done with it, a World War II memoir, which was Marty Laughlin in World War II. He was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was in an artillery company. And the stuff he writes about is very matter-of-factly. They get out of the front line at one point, I think right after the Battle of the Bulge, and they have their first hot meal, and they take their plates out to scrape the rest in the garbage cans, and there's the people who live in the community waiting there to take it out. So Marty and his friends said, okay, every night now, when we do this, we're gonna ask for extra food so they can share it with the people. But they came home, they didn't really talk a lot about the war. If you went to a VFW, or American Legion, and you were part of the war, the other guys knew about it, so you didn't have to talk about it with them. And you figure the people who weren't in it just wouldn't understand what you went through. And I wish I had had a chance to talk more with my dad after learning so much about it. But, you know, kids are busy doing other things. My take on the war at the time was I used to lug his war correspondent's armband and a couple of the citations he got and put them on and play with his 16 gauge double barrel shotgun that he picked up off of a German citizen who tried to stop an American tank with it. Out in the woods.
That armband might have come in handy with your later years at the Union Leader. You know, war correspondence may be helpful for some of the other battles you had, but that's a book for another.
I actually, my wife gave me one of those and put it on a coat, which I wore to Afghanistan.
Oh, amazing.
I was briefly embedded with New Hampshire's only National Guard company that is a combat unit, Charlie Company.
Living in your father's footsteps a bit.
Yeah, but not like what he did. Not even close.
You referenced, you know, that World War II affected everybody. Here is the book if you haven't seen it. This is the cover. And as you can see, it is Joe's father and mother and two of his siblings on the home front. And I was struck by this cover because it really spoke to how the family was truly impacted by this. I mean, there were those who went overseas, but then the people left at home were really, their lives were turned upside down as well. Talk a little bit about that.
That picture was taken at Christmas 1943, which was the only time my dad was home for 3 years. And he would soon be off again. He thought he was going to the Mediterranean, but Knox sent him a letter and says, hold up on that, because Knox knew what was coming. But my mom, from day one, was participating. She was taking her turn at the Candia Improvement Club during the day on blackout duty. Now, I'm still trying to figure out what either the Japanese or the Germans thought was of strategic interest in Candia, New Hampshire. But apparently there were going to be statewide blackouts, and volunteers would have to let everybody know and make sure that their windows were closed. I guess blackout duty during the day is better than blackout duty at night. But she wrote about canning vegetables, which is not my mother's forte. She was a little princess from the north end of Manchester, but she just dug right into it. She lied about my sister's age so she could get her in school a year early, so that my mother could take care of my hellion brother, John, who had been born in 1940 and was crawling into everything. She had to watch him, and she had to go to funerals of servicemen, because the aforementioned Margaret Callahan from the paper was my mother's aunt, and took her to the funerals of two of the editor's sons who were killed in the war. Robert Blood was the editor, and he lost 2 boys. So the home front got it as much as the others did. And I love my mother writing letters to my dad talking about the radio's on the frets, and she's really ticked because she can't hear Duffy's Tavern. I actually listen to Duffy's Tavern because I get old-time Sirius radio, but these are corny shows from that period. But that's all she had. She'd work during the day, take care of the kids, put them to bed, and sit and write letters to my dad and hope that he would write some to her.
Each of them, your father and your mother, really took a matter-of-fact approach to their letters. That basically, you could feel that they didn't want the other to worry about their situation, and yet they would tip enough of the cards to show what was going on. And at home, it was not easy times.
No. A lady stopped by her house, asked my mother to go with her up the road because a guy had dropped dead in his house, and the coroner wasn't going to get there for a while, and could my mother help pick this guy up and throw him in his chair or something? And my mother says apparently a couple of the other people were affected by this, but it didn't bother her. She'd seen enough of that as it was.
They really, their love story comes through in their letters quite a bit. And your mother seems to, in almost every letter, or the ones you published, tell him, you know what, you're not being a coward to step back for a minute or two. And I'm sure that was driven a lot by, she's reading these dispatches in the local papers and realizing how close he was to danger.
Yeah, he ran into one of Roosevelt's sons, who was a lieutenant colonel in the Marines, and minutes after meeting the son, an artillery burst hit a tree above Roosevelt, knocked him over, but he lived, and my dad lived, who was a couple of 100 feet away. Heartbreaking to me, letter from my dad's mom to him, saying that Judy, who's the little girl in the picture, spends a lot of time with Grammy to help my mother out, and goes to bed over there, and Judy asks Grammy, is my father's ship going to be blown up? Because she's hearing this in school, etc. And my older sister passed away before I got really into this book too, because she was born before the war and remembers a lot of it, and I wish I had more time to pull stuff out of her as well.
You indicated that, and this really struck me, if your dad had been a little less lucky,
Yep.
you wouldn't be here, and neither would two of your siblings.
I counted up the times. As I said, there was a time in the ditch. There was when they hit Utah Beach, the ship next to them blows up. There was another time when my dad was going to the same place as 3 other war correspondents. The other 3 were together. My dad was just with his driver, and the other 3 ran into a roadblock. Now, I do question the genetics in my family, because in this instance, the only reason that my father was not captured like the other 3, 2 of which spent the rest of the war in a German prison war camp. My dad didn't have that happen to him because he stopped and asked for directions. Now that is not in the McQuade genes whatsoever. So thank God that he stopped. They all got kidnapped. And he wrote about that in a very matter-of-fact way.
I mean, how close, really? And yeah, matter of fact to him, but to us, it's puts your hair on.
Yeah, well,
stand up.
he was at Guadalcanal, and that was just a terrible show for the Americans.
Well, you talk a little bit about that, because I think that, here on the East Coast especially, we're somewhat familiar with
Europe.
Europe.
Yeah.
But in the Pacific, that was a battlefield that was really horrible and took a real impact on your father's health as well.
I think it did. I think he got terrible skin diseases with it. He got, what's the one you got to take quinine for?
Malaria.
Yeah, malaria. He spent a lot of time with the Navy, as did the Marines, because they were on the ship till they found the island that they were going to either invade or jump over. And he loved the Navy, and he told me as a kid that, if you got to go in the service, go in the Navy. You might drown, but you get 3 hot meals a day, and you get to wear clean clothes on the ship. And he got a lot of friends who he kept after the Navy too, and loved to fly, but He became a diabetic immediately after coming home, which I think was in part the stress of the war that he was in, and therefore could not be a pilot. You cannot have a pilot's license if you're a diabetic. But you can fly a glider, because it's got no motor. So he took up soaring in gliders for a while as well. Yeah. But the war in the Pacific, you didn't hear a lot about it because it was so far away, and the communications weren't great, and you didn't know when your stuff was going to get sent out, and you didn't know how you were going to get to the war, because military came first, and some of the military wanted nothing to do even then with the press. And now, sorry buddy, you can't go. The best thing you can do is get assigned to one ship and stay with them for the duration. Well, my father wasn't for that, neither were the other correspondents. And they had some rough times. They had some fights with GIs, because my dad's rank, as with the other correspondents, was an officer. And some of the GIs and the Navy guys really didn't like them getting preferential treatment. And they got a tent over their heads sometimes.
Right.
Yeah. And not that it's relevant to anybody, but my old man did not like Ernest Hemingway.
Tell that story.
He thought he was a fraud. My dad knew Hemingway's first wife, because the editor of the Chicago Daily News was a gentleman named Paul Scott Maurer, and who had been a correspondent, and his son was a correspondent with my dad. His second wife was a lovely young woman named Hadley Hemingway Maurer, who'd been Ernest's first wife and got rid of her. And my dad said several times how this bragging SOB Hemingway during the war would say, you know, he pretty much won the war single-handedly, etc. I think my dad shared a tent with him for a while, but he thought he was a braggart, and most of the war correspondents were not. They told their stories. Some wrote books. My Aunt Margaret kept telling my father, as did others, well, you're going to write a book, aren't you? And I think he might have, but he got involved with other things, like making a living. He didn't get his job back with the Chicago Daily News. He says because he was asked towards the end of the war, April 1945, to look up a kid, first lieutenant named John S. Knight, Jr. John S. Knight, Jr.'s father had taken over the Chicago Daily News when Knox died. John S. Knight was part of the Knight-Ritter newspaper operation. And my dad dutifully looked up the kid. By the time he got there, the kid and three of his fellow GIs had been ambushed by the Germans and were killed. My dad had to write the story and also send a telegram to Mr. Knight. And he thinks the bearer of bad news didn't do so well. So my dad came back to New Hampshire. He wasn't going to work for Knox's widow because there was a lot of bad blood with a lot of people there. So he and another serviceman from World War II, actually a guy who was a historian for Third Army, and Blair Clark, they started a paper they called the New Hampshire Sunday News, which is why that paper, even though it's owned by the Union Leader, has a separate name, and even though my kid has now put out the Sunday News on Saturdays. So. I don't know what my father would make of that.
Well, that's a great segue. I mean, the media landscape has changed so much since World War II and through your career. What do you make of the changes? A bit of a loaded question between two newsmen, but what do you make of the changes?
Well, while there have been changes in technology which have been good for news organizations, that same technology, i.e. the internet, has killed a lot of print journalism. It's killed it not so much because of the news content in the papers, but because there's no advertising. Classifieds, there's no such thing anymore. Display ads, It's all online. And merchants in the world have discovered they don't need to pay newspapers to do this. So there are fewer newspapers, and the ones that have survived, there are a couple of notable exceptions, New York Times being one, but even the Post, which a guy named Jeff Bezos owns, has been laying off people right and left. It's not good for the body politic. It's not good for the lack of local news. Because who's keeping an eye on the people at City Hall? Never mind when we get into a war. But who's keeping an eye on the people who are making those determinations about the war and what is spent where? And it's not a good time for the country to be in without newspapers. And I don't know the answer to it. There's some people in Congress who want to publicly subsidize newspapers. There's a lot of pluses and minuses to that as well. I don't know what the answer is other than more civics and more teaching of government in high schools and elementary schools as well as colleges, hoping that the kids will realize we need unbiased information about our government to be able to do this. I don't know what my old man would make of it, or his brothers. Let's see, how many did he have working for him on the Sunday News? He had his brother Elias, he had his brother Joe, his brother Dave had already left, but the three of them were the Sunday News, along with another kid named Ben Bradley. Ben Bradley's, according to my dad, Ben Bradley's aunt put up some of the money to start the Sunday paper, so he got a job. Bradley liked to say in later years that Loeb fired him, but I think it was just a layoff. Sad state of newspapers.
And I'll just, as an editorial comment, and then see if the audience has some questions, say that we're lucky here in New Hampshire, very fortunate to have the union leader still as robust as it is, because if you travel, I'm sure many of you do, around the country, there's a phenomenon known as news deserts, where there are literal holes in communities where the news isn't covering it adequately or not at all. But here we still have quite a vibrant press scene, and the union leader, like Concord Monitor and others. So we're lucky because really society goes and ebbs and flows on the basis of civic engagement.
It's been that way since Tommy Jefferson wrote in some protection for him in the First Amendment to the Constitution. The founding fathers knew how important information was.
Indeed.
That's enough preaching. Hi, Betty.
So on that note, do we have any questions from folks? Yes?
So obviously your family is very important to you. How important was it for you to continue your father's legacy by working in the newspaper?
A good question. There wasn't a lot of thought into it. My dad sort of steered various siblings into different directions, which is why he was a pilot, which is, I think, why my brother became a Navy pilot and then commercial aviation. And the daughters became teachers. And the first job that he gave me was not in newspapers. He packed me and my mother into his Volkswagen and said, for the summer, you're going to go up and work at the Mount Washington Cog Railway. And I said, why am I going to do that? And he said, because you love trains. And I said, well, the Lionel train that I got when I was 6 years old, I loved until you locked it up and wouldn't let anybody play without his permission. But this, just crazy. And they went in and had lunch with Colonel Arthur S. Teague and his wife. Arthur Teague was one of the heroes of World War II, landed on the first day at Utah Beach, and was one of the most decorated soldiers of the war. So I did that for summers for 4 years. But I came back from the COG, and he said, how'd you like to be the office boy? And that was the start. And I will bore you with a real quick story. I was the office boy. I come in at Saturday mornings at 9 o'clock, and the city editor comes over, not Mr. Murtaugh, some relative of Mr. Murtaugh here, and says, your father wants you to meet the 4 o'clock bus. Very important, film on it, he's going to use the picture on the front page. So I do everything else. I mix the glue, I sharpen the pencils, I cut the teletype wires, etc. And I go at 4 o'clock, and the bus is late. Now, the news guys are going to want their lunches at 5 o'clock, and they're all going to yell bad words at me. And the guy who's running the bus station's a friend of mine. He says, don't worry, Joe, I'll get it for you. So I go home, I get all the lunch orders, take care of that. Go back, it's now 5 o'clock. The guy says, the bus came and left no package. I go back, I tell the city editor. My father comes in at 6 o'clock. By the way, when I took over the Sunday News, I came in at 9 o'clock in the morning. He came in at 6 o'clock in the evening, and always wondered why the paper was late. Couldn't understand it. But I see the city editor go over to him, tell him about it. My father turns, motions me over. I go up to him, and I'm, Dad, it wasn't on the bus. Did you meet that bus? Dad, I'm telling you, it wasn't on the bus. Did you meet that effing bus? I have to say no, and he dresses me down in front of everybody. I would have quit and gone home, but he was my ride. So I sat down, and the phone rang, and it was the correspondent who had taken the film. Joe, Kingle, tell your father I missed the 4 o'clock bus. It'll be on the 6 o'clock bus. I don't tell my father, but I go, I get the film, I come in with it, I throw it down on his desk and say, there's your fine film, sir. It wasn't me that fudged up, it was your correspondent. I'm just livid. Father looks across at the editor next to him, winks at him, and says to me, we accept your apology.
Wow.
So there wasn't any question I was going to do news, and I loved it. I fell into it. I did sports reporting, and I made a lot of money because Globe was the only game in town. He had 5 unions going, paid them whatever they wanted. Wish we hung on to some of that. And just amazing. It was a great career, and you got to see a lot of, you and I were talking about politics. You got to see, because of the presidential primary, all the people come in, or if they didn't come in, they stood on a truck in front of the paper and either didn't cry or did cry. Ed Musk. Any other questions?
Yes, not a question, but we talked about the home fronts. My mother was born in 1917. My father was born in 1910. My father worked at the shipyard during the war, and they lived in Portsmouth. After 9/11, I took my mother up to Rome, New Hampshire to meet up with her cousins and high school friends, the ones that were left. And it was interesting that all they talked about was Pearl Harbor Day. Growing up, I always figured World War II was over there or down there, not here. But for them, they were coming here. And one of the ladies was on the Civil Air Patrol, so she would climb up on top of the railroad bridge at night. And they were trained on what Japanese planes look like, German planes. I don't think people here understand that that war was coming here as far as everyone was concerned.
Well, people were very upset when they found out that Japan had invaded the Aleutians, because that gave them a jumping off point to bomb the West Coast. In Pearl Harbor, there were people from Manchester who were in that battle and lost their lives. The Union leader runs a Santa Fund every year. And on December 7th, without fail, you could see this gift in memory of so-and-so who had died at Pearl Harbor. And that now there were grandchildren picking up that thing. Yeah, the war was pretty all-encompassing.
I think I saw a hand in the back, yes?
Joe, one of the things you talked about, said many times, this concept of not talking about the war. You know, I think that's an important concept. You hear stories about someone passes away, the kids come to the funeral, and the military comes and gives them some medals and stuff. There is a lot of people who will not talk about what happened during the war. And then there are other people that talk a great deal. And I think because your father was a correspondent, I mean, he wrote about it, so it's kind of a lot different. But there's a lot of history that we lost. And I think there's a difference between telling a historical aspect of it than maybe other components of it.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people that suffered a lot of trauma. And I was lucky enough to talk to someone who's now passed away and that went into a concentration camp. And when I was working in Europe, I went to Bergen-Belsen. And that was one of the worst days of my life, just to tour the place. So I think that for some people, there's trauma, and I'm sure you spoke about it. Your father experienced that, right?
I'm sure he did. I wish I had known back then when the guys in the newsroom, they were World War II guys too, several of them. One guy was Billy Thornton. He was a kid during the war. He was in India. He was a ranger. Walter Healy, who was the city editor, was in the South Pacific. Joe Barney, the sports editor, South Pacific. The composing room, which used to have 100 people in it, by the way, the composing room was full of guys who were in the war, but they didn't talk much about it. That's the way it is.
Other questions? All right, well,
A very
Joe?
nice audience, very attentive.
it's been a pleasure.
If you would like a copy of the book, I have some which are at less than the retail price because I don't know how to make change. Although today, visiting my little sister in a nursing home, I always stop at the nearby Dunkin' Donuts to get her iced coffee, milk, 1 sugar. All I had is a $20 bill. I give it to the woman in the drive-thru. She says, "Do you want change?" I'll for 20? Yes. I would like a little change. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.